I'd like to welcome you to the ATRE webinar series. Today's subject is going to be the LCT1000, the generation 2 of that transmission itself, which was built between 2006 and basically mid to late 2010 applications. It is the 6-speed version of the transmission, not the 5-speed. The 5-speed is going to be a Gen 1, and the 6-speed, of course, is going to be the Gen 2. And then, of course, now there's also a generation 3, and that's going to lead me into my next little spiel for you. 2 weeks from now, we'll be having a webinar on the Generation 3. There were massive changes made to this transmission for the Gen 3 update, so you're definitely, if you're doing LCT1000 work, you're not going to want to miss that. Another little tidbit for everybody, the webinar system itself, the GoToMeeting system, is having some technical glitches, so if you are having some issues, you may want to try getting a hold of Lance and see if there's anything we can do on our end. Hopefully everything will work out okay and we won't have any little glitches along the way there. But just be aware we did have a little snafu here about 20 minutes ago with the GoToMeeting, so needless to say, we're hoping they've got it all fixed. So with that said, let's move to our next slide here. Our sponsor for today is Seal Aftermarket Products. They're your source for engineered solutions. I want to thank those guys greatly because they're allowing us to do the presentations out in the field so we can get this type of information out to everybody. If you'd like to contact them, we're giving you their toll-free number as well as their web address, www.sealaftermarketproducts.com. So again, thanks to those guys for helping us out. Let's do a little bit of housekeeping before we get into this whole thing. First off, if you'd like to talk to Lance or you want to contact him, you got some ideas for some webinars or suggestions or whatever it happens to be, hit him at lwiggins@atre.com and he'll respond back to you about whatever it is you're sending him emails about. On the connection side of the issue, just like I told you guys before, make sure you're hooked to the wall itself with your computer, not via a wireless router. We've had lots of issues with wireless routers, so needless to say, make sure that you're hooked up to the wall. The handout itself is in a PDF format. I've had guys ask me the last couple weeks, I can't open the handout, how come? It's because you have to have an Adobe Reader program. Adobe Reader, or an Adobe program anyway. Adobe Reader is the most common of them. It's available free on the internet. You can simply go to the internet, search Adobe Reader, and download Adobe Reader, obviously, to your machine, and then you'll be able to open the PDF style document. So very simple process, allows you to open it or print it, whatever you'd like to do. When it comes to questions today, a couple different ways you can ask them. You can raise your hand if you want to go on live, or you can simply do the easiest thing, which is click on the questions box, type your question or your comment in. As soon as you hit the send button, it automatically pops up on my screen. Therefore, I'm going to see exactly what you're asking, and I'll repeat the question so everybody can hear it. So again, a couple different ways that you can do the questions if you have questions as we go through it. The survey itself is going to follow our presentation today. It's an automated style survey. We'd appreciate you guys filling it out. Kind of gives us a little bit of a idea of what you thought about the presentation, were you having audio problems, video problems, anything like that, so we know what to deal with when it comes to the next webinar. So again, appreciate people filling that out. So without further ado, let's take a look at the LCT1000 Generation 2. The LCT1000 has been around since 2001. Probably one of the finest transmissions, I'm of course biased, but one of the finest transmissions that we've ever had in the marketplace itself. The Gen 1s came out in 2001. They ran through 2005. They were all 5-speed transmissions. The Gen 2s came out in 2006. They ran through, obviously, mid-2010. They're a 6-speed style transmission itself. So you're going to know immediately whether you've got a Gen 1 or Gen 2. So let's say it's right at that 2005, 2006 cutoff. You're going to know based on whether it's going to be a 5-speed or a 6-speed. You're also going to know by looking at the RPO code. If you look at the top of the page, we're talking about RPO code MW7. So if you went to the glove box of these trucks, pop the glove box open, look at that little service part ID label that's in there, it'll say MW7 on it if it's a Generation 2 transmission. Major changes were made to this transmission. Most of the changes were dealing with torque capacity situations. This is a pretty competitive market. In fact, it's an extremely competitive market. Ford, Dodge, and GM are all competing for the same customer. And so everybody keeps increasing their engine torque output, and every time they do that, the transmission side of the issue has to increase their torque capacity. So the LCT1000 Gen2, its primary change was to improve torque capacity, along with that, fuel economy. So they've made changes to the electronic system, the hydraulic system, and of course the mechanical system. As I just told you earlier, this is the new 6-speed version, came out in 2006. Again, it's behind the 8.1 gas and the 6.6 Duramax. The 8.1 gas, of course, is no longer with us. They've dropped that engine because of fuel economy issues. So now you've got just the 6.6 Duramax that's out there. It's a 6-speed automatic. They did not make any clutch design changes in the transmission itself as far as adding new clutches to the transmission to increase the torque capacity. Same clutches, they just cycle them on and off in a different sequence. You will have tap shift capabilities on all these Gen 2s, so you're going to be able to physically upshift and downshift the transmission mechanically by pushing a button on the shift lever. As we talked about, improvements to torque capacity. Question just popped up. I'm one of those with no audio. Would like a copy of the recorded session if available. You betcha we'll get you a copy. So you bet we could definitely do that. So if you're having an audio difficulty, let Lance know, email him, and he should be able to get you a copy of this whole thing because we've got it recorded. So here we go with the rest of this stuff. Internal mode switch. The whole idea behind having the internal mode switch was to replace the external NISBU switch, which of course was your park neutral switch we had so much trouble with. The park neutral switch was mounted on the side of the transmission, and we had a lot of moisture intrusion issues into it. So they basically cut that switch out and put a internal mode switch or an IMS inside the transmission itself, right on the shift linkage. Got a new controller. The controller is much smaller, about a quarter the size, half the size of what the old controller was, mounted right on the radiator core support. It uses an 80-pin connector with an over-center type of lock mechanism to hold that in place. Updated valve body, major changes to the valve body when they went to Gen 2. Solenoid changes, piping added to it, a whole bunch of different things. So this valve body is not interchangeable with a Generation 1 valve body. You either have a 20-pin or a 24-pin connector, depending on if you got a light-duty truck or if you have a commercial level truck. So let's say the pin routing and the pin locations are different for the Gen 2s versus the Gen 1s. And we'll show you that as we go through this. Updated pump design for quieter operation. Most of you guys are aware that we had real problems with pump noise and also drain down issues. They went after that as an issue on these transmissions, and the updated pump will back service the previous design transmissions. So you will be able to take the updated pump as one of the few things as part of this update that you can actually back service previous design boxes. All right. As you can see here, this transmission is a 6-speed. Both 5th and 6th gear are overdriven. And again, we're giving you the differences in clutch capacity or torque capacity of the transmission there on the screen. Clutch apply chart, nothing razzle-dazzle about that. We're just, again, changing who's going to come on when. And needless to say, that's how we're going to end up with the 6 gears. Features of the transmission, tap shifts, we talked about that. Grade braking is probably the most important feature on an LCT1000. Most people love that feature. That's one of the reasons they buy the Allison, because the grade braking is so great when you're towing a vehicle or any type of load, like a trailer or anything like that. The thing I want you to be aware of with grade braking, you in turn have to have it in tow haul mode in order for grade braking to function. So if you do not have the vehicle in tow haul mode with this transmission, it will not work. The new 6L80s and 6L90s now have grade braking also, and it's the same exact thing. You have to have it in tow haul. So that means you have to push the button on the end of the shift lever in order to get the little picture of the trailer popping up on your dash, or else the grade braking feature will not function. And again, most customers aren't aware of that. The diesels have cruise control grade braking, which is a great feature, which basically means you don't have to kick the cruise off in order for your grade braking to work. It does have grade braking itself as soon as you in turn select tow haul mode. Another feature, of course, is tow haul. That's designed to change your shift algorithms. In other words, the shift points of the transmission itself based on you packing a load. Shift stabilization, pretty simple there. All of the electronic transmissions have shift stabilization. It's kind of a frustrating thing for a lot of customers because they don't understand it. A good old example here would be you got an old 700R4 transmission, you're going up a hill, and you lift off the gas, the transmission will upshift. This transmission won't do that. It will hold that particular gear that it was in. So bottom line is they tried to do this to prevent shift hunt so the transmission doesn't hunt back and forth. Same thing we've done on 4L60Es and 4L80Es and 6L80s and 6L90s. So this feature is pretty well standard across all GM lines. Heater performance mode, this is a kind of a neat thing here. Your diesels don't build much temperature. So what it boils down to is the system itself is designed to delay your shifts when you in turn have a cold engine and cold transmission to try to increase engine temperature, so obviously the heater works sooner. That's the whole idea behind it. Again, customers will comment about how the transmission is shifting different cold versus when it gets warm. They're correct, it does, and that's this performance mode we're talking about. Low traction mode, kind of an interesting one here. Everybody remembers the old C6s, and when you put them in manual second, they started and stayed in second gear. Well, this is kind of the same basic principle. Ford did that way back when, and of course they've been emulated. 4L60s had that feature, and several other transmissions were like that. Some of the 4L80s were like that. They did it very specifically to reduce the amount of torque going to the tires. So if you obviously started the transmission in a different gear, then you'd reduce the amount of torque available to the tires, therefore eliminating spin. That was the theory. Well, on these new transmissions, they actually are a little smarter than that. They monitor to your front wheel speed, sensor speed, and your prop shaft speed. And when it figures out that you're spinning the tires, the rear tires, it automatically upshifts the transmission into second gear. So this is a feature, again, doesn't require the customer to do anything, but it may confuse the customer and why it's doing it. It is an override even for manual shift control. Last session, somebody asked about what if you put the transmission into tap shift modes where you're trying to tap shift it while you're stuck. Well, if those rear tires slip and it enters low traction mode, it will stay in low traction mode until the speeds equalize from the front wheels to the back wheels. So kind of a neat little feature. So what's been changed in this transmission? Well, basically everything's been changed from the front of the transmission to the back. As you can see, we got a different torque converter. We have a different pump, and the pump, again, will be one of the few pieces here that's actually interchangeable. We got a different rotating clutch assembly. So both clutches inside that clutch drum there, as we move from the front of the transmission to the back, there are different clutch drum and different components inside. All the planetaries were changed. The valve body on the bottom of this thing is all changed. So the oil channeling and everything basically that you dealt with before is now different than it was previously on the Gen 1s. So again, not a lot of interchange. Some things will, but the vast majority of things will not. Here's your rotating clutch assembly. This is your 1, 2, 3, 4, and your 4, 5, 6 clutch drums. Left-hand side, of course, is your were completely changed, as I showed you in the earlier picture. Heavy-duty planetaries, heavier-duty bearings were put into this transmission. Torque converter, same way. Most of you guys are aware we had some torque converter leakage issues where the welds were cracking on the lugs on the converter, causing transmission fluid to seep from that area. And guys would think it's the front seal, and it's not the front seal. It's actually coming from those welds. So they've reinforced that area itself and that changed the welding process for assembly of that converter. In addition, along with that, the pilot has changed. So when we look at the 2005 LCT1000, on that valve body, you're going to find you got a couple trim solids. The trim solids were used to control the aggressiveness of your shift. And then, of course, you got your regular shift solids. And a PWM solenoid for TCC. And then if you have a 2004 or 2005, you got a mainline oil pressure solenoid. So we've changed a bunch of that. Now, that modulated main solenoid was simply carried over into the Generation 2. But the other solenoids, especially the trim solids, they were changed out. They're now running radiator pressure control solids in replacement of the trim solenoid. So totally different design solenoid, not interchangeable. So you can't pull the solenoid out of one generation and put it in the other generation. The IMS itself was updated, to, I should say changed from a NISBU switch, in other words the one on the side, the Prindle switch, to the IMS, so it's mounted inside the transmission. Got a PWM TCC solenoid that was changed obviously over to a variable bleed solenoid, kind of like the regular trim solenoids were. And of course, we got a completely different wiring harness because you have different solenoid configurations. And so as we go through this, I'll show you some schematics that show you both pin locations for the harness side as well as the transmission side. Last but not least, the other thing you're going to notice about this transmission is the feed pipe itself for 6th gear was also added here. So they didn't have to completely redesign the whole transmission. They simply added this pipe to rechannel oil for 6th gear. This transmission valve body itself, the upper right-hand corner that you look there, that little green bolt-on valve body, that was your pressure control solenoid. Again, that's been there since 2004. That was an update that we went through back then. This solenoid, just so everybody is aware, when we had a Gen 1 transmission, you ran with fixed line pressure. This transmission here runs with what's called stepped line pressure. When the vehicle itself is at idle or low torque settings or low road speeds operation, this solenoid is turned on. What it does is lowers line pressure. So it's kind of like a Chrysler where it actually drops your line pressure down. When you start putting some engine torque to this transmission, it then starts varying the signal going to that pressure control solenoid, but it doesn't vary it like a regular pressure control solenoid does. It steps it. So you will see different pressures depending on different torque loads. So this is not like a standard pressure control solenoid. When they went to the Gen 3 units, you'll learn about in another 2 weeks, they went to a standard pressure control solenoid and algorithm so that it works like a regular 4L60E or 4L80 solenoid would work. Lower right-hand corner of the picture, you see the manual linkage itself, and you can see the IMS hooked to that link. Again, very similar to what they've done on the 4T60E, 4T65E, I should say. 4L60Es, the late model 4L60Es are that way. Simply plugs into that shift shaft, and as the shift shaft rotates, the IMS creates a different signal sequence. You got your pressure control solenoids for TCC, and of course your solenoids that replaced your trim solenoids are now called pressure control solenoid 1 and pressure control solenoid 2. This picture is popping up right now. The reason I put this picture is pretty simple. A lot of guys think that when they look at these solenoids, that these solenoids are directly controlling the clutches. They are not. They're controlling a valve. So if you look at that schematic, you can see that pressure control solenoid is actually controlling a valve, and that valve is controlling the pressure going to the clutch. So my whole point is, you can still have a stuck valve problem causing you hard shifts, soft shifts, whatever kind of issues it was, and not be able to fix it by simply replacing the pressure control solenoid. So just keep in mind that this valving itself they went to the Gen 2s. It was updated again in later model, Gen. We had a specific bearing inside the transmission, the T5 bearing that was failing, and it would fill the metal, metal particulate. And of course, these solenoids are giant electromagnets, so they'd stuck a bunch of metal in there, and they needed to have a shorted solenoid code. So what they did to try to prevent that was they came out with this updated solenoid harness that you're seeing in the right-hand picture, with that little tab that sticks down, and that tab basically prevents the bridging of the terminals themselves. So there were actually two different versions of this harness for the Gen 2 transmissions. The IMS, as I talked about a little bit earlier, its job is simply to replace the Prindle switch that's on the side of the transmission. We had lots of troubles with moisture intrusion into that Prindle switch itself, causing us all sorts of issues, such as a limp home issue where the truck didn't want to move. So what they did basically was went to an IMS design. So you've got, as you can see here, 4 different pins that are going to be feeding ground for the signal voltages coming out of the TCM. So basically the operation of this is no different than the Leader Prindle switch. The only thing is it's mounted internal to the transmission itself. So you'll have those scan tool displays that you can use to diagnose this. The TCM had a major update. In fact, the vendor was actually changed in the TCM when they went to the Gen 2s. As you can see, they had different types of communication protocols. And this is one thing that's kind of important with this. The gas engine applications all use Class 2 data. Your diesel applications, the early ones, all used a GM LAN system. When you get into Gen 3s, they're all CAN data bus. So my point to you guys is this. Your scan tool may talk to one of these or a couple of these, or if you're really lucky, it'll talk to all 3. But my point is here that if you're having troubles communicating with an LCT1000, it could be a problem with the scan tool software not being updated to fit whatever the protocol is that it uses for communication. So you're going to want to make sure that your scan tool is capable of talking to 3 different forms of data. Class 2 data, LAN data, local area network data, and then of course the new late model ones are all CAN data bus. Uses an 80-pin connector with a cam lock on it. So what's that basically mean? It basically means that you got an over-center or lock that you push down, it locks the connector in place. And the TCM, of course, is mounted in the radiator fan shroud, a little bit different location than what we had next to the core support. So let's take a look at some of the features of this transmission. Well, the tap shifts we've kind of talked about. The one thing I will mention to you on tap shifts that's kind of important is there are override functions for tap shifts. What it boils down to there, folks, is if the controller thinks that you're trying to do abusive maneuvers, for example, you're sitting still at a stop sign and you put the transmission in 6th gear. It won't allow the transmission to start in 6th gear. And the theory is, obviously, you're going to damage something. So the system's smart enough to know if you're doing something dumb, is my point, and it will take care of that. Same thing on downshifts. If you're trying to downshift the 1st gear at 80 miles an hour, it will inhibit that downshift. So again, the tap shifts are there. You use the shift button right on the shift lever itself, but there are override functions where the TCM can override you even though you have the transmission put into manual mode. The tow haul grade braking features, we talked about it a little bit earlier. It's designed when you have heavy loads in the vehicle. GM says anytime you have above 75% of GCWR, which is gross combined weight rating. So in other words, the truck and the trailer are more than 75% of what they're supposed to be. Bottom line is they want you to be in tow haul mode. And remember, as I talked about earlier, you're going to have it in tow haul mode in order for the grade braking function to actually work. So all the later ones are set up, the software is, it will not allow tow haul to function unless you have it or I should say, well, it will not allow grade braking to function unless you have it in tow haul mode. So again, we get customers who do not understand how it's supposed to work. This is how it's supposed to work. Here's your button that we talked about as far as controlling the manual shifts themselves, the tap shifts. Up is going to be the positive button itself, and down is going to, of course, be the little slash that you've got there, the plus and the minus. So it's as simple as that. You put it in M range, and you simply hit the button that you want to actuate, and off to the races you go with it. Heater performance mode, we talked about that a little bit. The diesels do not build a lot of engine temperature, so they try to warm them up by delaying transmission shifts. So you get customers who come in and talk about this with you, hey, the transmission's not shifting right. You kind of need to explain to them that this is what it's doing. The 6L80s, 6L90s all do the same exact thing. So these functions we're talking about are not just for the Allison, even though we're dealing with the Allison right now. Low traction mode, kind of a neat little algorithm. Again, as I talked about earlier, if you are slipping the rear tires, it looks at the front wheel speed versus the rear wheel speed and says, hey, this guy is spinning the tires. It automatically upshifts the transmission to second gear, and off to the races you go with it. Shift stabilization, pretty simple there. Again, that's to try to prevent shift hunt. This area here, we're talking about cold, normal operations, probably the most important page that you guys have from the customer standpoint. These transmissions operate differently based on transmission temperature and intake air temperature, which is going to be ambient air temperature. So depending on what your transmission fluid temperature is versus obviously your intake air temperature determines what gears you get and whether torque converter clutch actually works or does not work. So again, if you're having customers coming in talking about it missing gears or they don't think the torque converter clutch is working, you're going to want to pull this sheet out and give it to them because this is how it's supposed to actually work. Modes of operation, there is a little difference here between the 6.6 and the 8.1s. Remember, they don't build the 8.1 gas anymore. But again, so you know what features are there, I put this chart in so you know which functions this thing should have and which ones it will not. So now let's take a look at a little bit of the update stuff. Rather than going through 56 different pages on each of these different components, I put it together as a chart. Every one of these components you see on these next few pages is a different component. So the part number was changed. For the most parts, most of those part numbers will not interchange. So again, if they issued a new part number, there are a couple exceptions where they will interchange. Most of them will not. They're not designed to be interchanged. So again, they changed planetaries, as you can see here. Torrington bearings have been updated for strength. Clutch components have all been updated. The pump assembly, of course, has been updated, and that is one of the things that you can back service. So if you look at that bottom part number, clear on the bottom, it says pump kit. That's the part number that you would order to allow you to back service a previous designed transmission, a Generation 1 transmission. It'll include the pump, and obviously the stator support, the wear plate, an instruction sheet, a whole bunch of little tidbit stuff that you're going to get with that. So that's how you'd actually back service. You'd order that kit. Now when it comes to the wiring harness itself, as we talked about, the wiring harness is going to be different because we got different cell lines in this thing. We've got an IMS that we've added to it. So the chart here is to give you the pin configurations and color codes and circuit numbers so you know what you're looking at for your particular connector. So this is the harness side connector right here. And now we're going to see a picture of the transmission side connector popping up. So same basic principle here, so that you can make your electrical measurements. You have a picture that shows you obviously the different pin locations and color codes. One of the other things that changed with this transmission was DTCs. They added a potload of DTCs. The Generation 1 Allisons were fairly weak when it came to DTCs. There were lots of different situations that you could get yourself into where you could have a situation where the truck went to neutral, as an example, and you had no code set, and you had no idea where to go. You know, it's basically a shotgun approach. You started with the most logical things first, like the Prindle switch, you know, those types of things, solenoid valve sticking and so forth. You know, the common things we ran into, those are the areas that you would go to. Well, they finally figured out that, hey, we got to have some more trouble codes. So there are 3 full pages of codes here. Here's your page 1. Here's your page 2 that just popped up. And of course, here is page 3 of trouble codes. So as you can see, there are trouble codes literally for trouble codes for the new Gen 2s. So you should have a pretty good diagnostic support for the Generation 2s, much, much better than we had for the Generation 1s. And the Generation 3s, they've added even more codes, as you'll see here in a couple weeks. Now, with all that being said, looks like we've probably completed our presentation for today. Looks like we're done with lunchtime here, so you guys can actually go back and make some money. Again, we'd like to thank the guys from Seal Aftermarket Products for sponsoring us. And with that said, if you have any questions, feel free to just type the question in right now, and I'll try to answer it as we go through it. When we're all said and done here today, you should have a survey that should pop up. That survey itself will be automated. You can simply click on the answer that you'd like to submit to us. If you'd like to contact Lance directly, you can simply hit him at lwiggins@atre.com. Remember, 2 weeks from now, we're going to be going through the Gen 3 Allisons. Major, massive changes in that transmission. So basically, everything was changed but the pan bolts. So you're not going to want to miss that if you do Allison work. We'll then be following that up 2 weeks later, which would be August 20th, 21st, with an AF21 presentation. And everybody knows all the problems we're having with the AF21. So we'll be taking you through some of the common issues we're running with the AF21s and how we're fixing some of those issues. So again, thank you guys very much for attending. Looks like they don't have any questions popping up here. So you guys have a good rest of your lunch break and have a nice week.